So Heidegger tells us we are not to say ist sein da, as though we were asking if some old fusty professor were hiding under his desk in his office. Is being there. We're not asking about a personal God in the Christian sense. We're asking about being, but then neither are we asking about Brahman or something which has been represented or thought in any sense. We're not to ask, so we have this negative injunction, streng verboten, strictly forbidden to fuss around looking under rugs and couches and pillows for Sein or being. At the same time, the same thing apparently goes for time. We're not to say ist seit da, as though we were requesting a meeting with time, and we expected time to come before us either as something standing before us like a chair, or as something that we represent to ourselves in this Kantian fashion. So what I wanted to go towards is this, let's say, a little house cleaning with respect to how I believe Heidegger understands the so-called idealism. This is grossly and just absurdly misunderstood in somebody like Graham Harman, who keeps repeating this notion that nobody has gone beyond realism and idealism, which is just absolute stupidity, because that's exactly what Heidegger claimed to do from the beginning. So in Kant, so we get in the analytic tradition, which is all powerful and ripples through everything at all moments, this constant notion of something that's independent of us without any clarity about what we're really discussing, and why it is that Kant is claiming that it's our brain. We have these terms like it's in the brain or something, when we're in fact talking about something that Kant describes as intuition. Intuition usually means the immediate they mean the same thing in the German tradition as what the Catholics would say when they say we apprehend something. Like I look and I see this is the tree. I intuit the essence of the tree. I intuit the essence of mud, and I don't think we're meant to say that we can intuit the essence of justice, but I don't see why we can't intuit a particular act of justice, as though if we were, if it is justice, what King David did with regard to the question of the divided baby, and we were there and we witnessed it, then we could say that we intuited an act of justice as a specific occasion in which justice was present. But whether we can intuit justice itself or the high ideas, I'm not sure on that point. But in modern thinking, what we're mostly talking about are things you can point to, and not the things that don't appear in a mirror, as Socrates said. So it's so far as we're talking about both the things that are supposedly come forward of themselves, like stones and mud and hair, the things by nature, the subject of what used to be called natural history until it became biology, and other disciplines such as geology and so forth, and the things that are by art, the things that have been made, but which we can also point to: chair, table, parapet of the castle, and so forth. These things all really, when we take them as the ready to hand, this whole field of the ready to hand, are the things which are, from the common sense point of view, independent of us. this is what Kant is. Uh, this is really what Kant is saying. He's saying the whole ready to hand is a mistake. There is no ready to hand. That's just a bias of common sense. And the proof is that if I see, like Orson Welles in the film The Stranger, looking from a clock tower at these little tiny beings, which are supposedly human beings, and says, look at those little tiny ants down there. Um, he's playing the part of an escaped Nazi, a fiendish mind that sees human beings as little ants. So what Kant is saying is just what George Berkeley, or Berkeley, Bishop George Berkeley said later on. And I suspect Heidegger, who wrote about Berkeley or Berkeley early in his career, drew more from Berkeley than he did from Kant, because he only studied Kant in depth, as you will see if you read the exchanges between Heidegger and Jaspers quite a few years after he wrote Being in Time, although he had read Kant, I think, as a teenager. But there's a very great difference between reading and a close study of something, and also there's a very great difference between a close study of something and a close study of something with real knowledge of that subject matter. So Kant is saying those tiny little ants down there, what you call people, that's how you're represented. It's not that they're further away from you and therefore they appear to be smaller, but they're genuinely phenomenologically, and then we push into Husserl. This, maybe there's a kind of the way Heidegger reads Kant, maybe there's some superimposition of Husserl's phenomenology, but this is just how Husserl also understands phenomenology from the point of view of this transcendental ego. Those things are simply represented as small. It's not that they're small because there's really a thing, not because there's really a given thing, a thing that's there, called space, but they're just represented that way. In the ready to hand, when we're absorbed, space would be there. But in the representation world, in the phenomenological representation, the space is just, there is no space. Things are smaller because they're represented smaller. So Heidegger says, we're supposed to say es gibt sein, es gibt Zeit. There is time, there is being, but we don't know where to look for it. It's neither there according to what is independent of us in the common sense, normal sense, which corresponds to the ready to hand, which is that it's something is over there. I apprehend it or I intuit the essence of it, but that's only because I'm looking at it and I passively receive the knowledge, as Socrates would understand it. Because I look, I use my eyes, I look, I receive it, I see something independent of me, and the knowledge comes to me, and then the knowledge is in me as a potential, although there's this strange question of how we could be mistaken about something we know that Socrates goes into. What Kant does is not, I think what happens with Kant is that in the analytic philosophy department, there's a tendency to present Kant and to read Kant as though we were talking about some question like, if you had an eye with 4 cones instead of 3, and the sense data came to that eye, how would it be modulated? And then das Ding an sich is then meant to be the sense data before it's been somehow come through this prism of some organ, or through the human being, or through the requirements of the of any possible experience for a human being, as though we were constantly talking about some question like, here we have a brain, and then this brain is the brain of a particular alpha ape, which is come to dominate everything on the planet and through evolution, and it's the fittest, and this is the highest prism through which the light of dusting on Sish can shine, and but it's limited to shining in this way where it has to have time and space, has to be represented for any possible experience, has to be represented that way due to the limits of this hardware, as it were. But Kant isn't saying anything of the sort. Kant, what we have a problem with is, one, Kant is, it's we're staring across a vast quagmire, just vast, where we cannot understand what it was like before the theory of evolution, which we've gotten, as Strauss would say, as mother's milk, and as Strauss would say, um, um, we can't see the air that we're looking through, as it were, where the Lichtung is, where the lighting is, where the opening is that we have as our world. We cannot see that air, and the only way to get any sense that it exists is through this, going through this second cave, the study of history. But then we have these great difficulty that we don't know where history is. The past is not even past, and we're in the midst of extreme difficulties, and then we look for some guidance, and we find guidance in those thinkers like Heidegger that tell us that they've seen something, and then we try to see what they've seen, on the assumption that a break from Das Mann or from the British empiricism, which dominates the planet, I believe, I think it's just as powerful in China as it is everywhere else, and so that you have a rearguard movement in people like Dugin and people like Heidegger himself, so far as Heidegger says the Russians must be allowed to express their Dasein and unencumbered and not shackled by the planetary spread of techne and the world that goes along with techne, and the kind of thinking paideia, the way of moving forward in all things that goes along with techne when it comes into the primary education. So to go on to a step from Kant, so Kant, for instance, let's remember, beside from what's in evidence that he didn't know anything about evolution, beside from the fact that Darwin only came around 50 years or so later after Kant died with his book. It's that Kant, when he spoke about, you might think that there's, for Kant, there's sort of like squirrels have one way of representing the world to themselves, humans, and then aliens or something like that. And then this rational sentient being that Kant says must, according to reason, because Kant still believes in reason in something like the way Bertrand Russell still believed in logic, as though it were totally free of any body, of any brain, of any evolutionary development, of any organism, of anything, and was simply a feature of deity. So Kant speaks of aliens because he knows that there's a galaxy and that there are stars that were previously unseen. He doesn't know that there's anything beyond the Milky Way, but he knows that there's innumerable bright, sparkling stars out there, and in their light are other beings, but he pictures them simply like us, but at a different level of moral development. So in other words, he thinks there's human beings and there's trees and there's everything here on those other planets, but they're at a different level of moral development. That's everything for him, is the moral development. And so when he says what has happened up till now is no limit on what could happen, in just the same way that in the Zizek problems we talk about the rejection of the lack of the depriving of the dignity of minorities on the basis of pointing to historical disadvantage and saying that they are formed through historical advantage, and they do not have this power to throw off what has happened up till now. They don't have the supreme power. This is one of the strange. Just on a side note, this is one of the great moments in Kant, is where Kant totally throws off Aristotelianism in a way that's not always noticed, which is that Aristotle took for granted that there's only, and just like the Catholic tradition, that there's probably only a few people that can reach the highest level of moral development. Kant said, no, there's this native genius of all human beings, and all human beings can reach the highest level of moral development, and that plays an enormous role in politics today. But one can say this is again a question of how so far is the general development of the world. Just for instance, you can get all kinds of I forget the name of the American economist. His name starts with an H. I can't remember, but he has something about the development of material things, of technology going along with the development of political and legal ideas. But one could say how so far as the whole world is developing in a certain way, these ideas that Kant simply articulated more cogently and more forcibly than others, so that they now have this might have just been developed and articulated by others. But on the other hand, it could be that he added something to them which nobody else could have, and his formulations of them brought resistless power to them, which they wouldn't otherwise have had. There's questions along those lines. When we go over to George Berkeley, then one can see the exact same thing. The analytic department, philosophy department, radically misunderstands George Berkeley, which anyone can see if you just read, say, the first volume of George Berkeley's collected works, where he's repeatedly mocking the philosophers and mocking their lack of common sense, and saying no Irishman can attain to this sort of notion. What he's vying against is this same thing is something along the lines of what Roger Penrose sort of more or less embraces with regard to the intrinsic nature of numbers and all these things that Kepler spent such a enormous and improbable amount of his life studying, the Platonic solids and all these strange figures, because of the idea that they were in the core of the cosmos, like as though inside the objects. And then in something like Newton, where you try to work out how you have elliptical motion of the in the stars, as was observed, I think by Kepler. Whether this elliptical motion is genuinely part of the arithmetic that's inside the matter, as it were, such that there's a material intuition of something which isn't measurable in the ready-to-hand sense, but which can be grasped to actually be obtaining within objects, even though we can't see them. And then Berkeley says, well, no, there's just what we can see. There's nothing more. That's all he was saying. So what he means is that, and he repeatedly says things like the horses are in the stable. So in other words, for common sense, even when we're not looking, the things behind me are still there, right? This is the ready to hand from the Berkeleyan so-called idealism, which is George Berkeley was really a very common sense kind of guy, although he does go into many examples along the lines of Husserl, where he says things like the moon looks really small now. If we go closer to it, is that actually more real? Is that actually more real? If we're standing on the moon, is that what the real moon is, or isn't the way the moon looks from to us now just as real? He does go into some things which suggest a kind of whimsicality almost, and he does give an opening for people to walk through the door and think that. But that's not what his main meaning was. His main meaning was to reestablish something like common sense. But then he also, in a way, he does what Heidegger does. He says there's common sense, that things that are behind me are actually behind me, but then also there's this other thing that phenomenologically, there's no real core to any being. We see it from this angle, we see it from that angle. There's no way of glancing at something where we suddenly see the truth of it. We're just seeing different sides of it. So then when you get to Heidegger, you can see this is brought to the ready to hand and the present to hand, where Heidegger retains in the fullest sense the common sense in connection to the ready to hand, in connection to absorption, where we treat ourselves as an entity in the world, where things being independent only means that the horse is in the stable, just as common sense states it, and where things being a matter of thought or intuition means the phenomenology is true. The moon is small when it's represented as small, and we can flip back and forth between those two understandings, and they're both part of this which es gibt sein, es gibt Zeit. So they're both somehow there, like the example of where does it happen when the night gathers out of the day.